architecture that exists, but I think is often forgotten. So the first challenge is that the world has never been more geopolitically contested. The government of Canada is very concerned with all of the problems that come with anarchy. Things like the hegemonic struggle, power transitions, spheres of influence, and reactionary nationalism. The effects of anarchy are more stark because of the worldwide pandemic and global recession. Now is not the time for a showdown between globalists and nationalists, but that seems to be what is happening. And in the Arctic, this showdown manifests itself in two extreme ways. Nationalists tend to want to confirm ownership and control and decision-making power of the Arctic, while globalists want to treat the Arctic like a park and ban all activity. Canada, as a coastal state of the Arctic Ocean, is nationalist when it comes to the Arctic, as is the US. But we have different understandings about what are the major challenges in the Arctic and what resources should be spent to address them. Whitney Lackenbauer talks about threats to, through, and in the Arctic. And I suggest that while the US focuses on the through and in, Canada focuses on the to. Canada cites climate change and growing international interest in the Arctic as pressing concerns requiring Canada to exercise its sovereignty. The US, for political reasons, downplays climate change, and being a world power necessarily focuses on the great power competition. This means that they reference the North American Arctic as an avenue of approach and are far more focused on threats in the Arctic, such as foreign controlled ownership of mines and infrastructure. Now, this does not mean that the US does not care about the effects of the warming Arctic, or that Canada completely ignores Russia and China. But the different priorities create resource allocation and attention challenges that are increasingly difficult to reconcile. And it means that Canada and the US are speaking different languages when it comes to threats. The North Warning System is a good example. It is configured to detect threats through the Arctic. Both the US and Canada readily acknowledge that the North Warning System, with its Commodore 64 vintage technology, and one of the very few NORAD-owned assets, needs to be replaced, moved, reimagined. It is crucial for deterrence. Both states are working to devise new technological and systems solutions, but while the US can convince even a divided Congress of the need to spend billions for systems that provide a critical operating picture, and one which, with forethought, could capture information for other government departments as well. Canada has usually had a very difficult time convincing the Canadian public that spending billions with the US to jointly defend North America is money well spent. While the US specifically references Russia as an acute threat and China a chronic one in the Arctic context, Canada shies away from naming a particular adversary. We use the term only 3 times in Strong, Secure, and Engaged, our defense policy, and reference Russia as problematic in an Eastern European context and China in a South China Sea context. Canada only references NATO's concern with Russia in an Arctic context, but this is assumed to reference the Greenland, Iceland, UK, Norway gap. While Canada sees the Arctic as exceptional, still a zone of cooperation and low tension, the US is growing increasingly skeptical, evidenced by stark warnings from Pompeo, especially with regard to China. Canada and the US still say there is no imminent military threat to the Arctic, but NORAD, for example, is quick to highlight when Russia has tested North American air defense identification zones. This miscommunication is more stark today because the US is feeling more vulnerable despite the increasing militarization of its foreign policy. It has not had to think about homeland defense from home so consistently. The US strategy has been to project power globally, uncontested, to protect the homeland. And now attention is focusing on the fact that the Arctic connects Europe, Asia, and the US homeland and is no longer a moat. For its part, Canada underestimates how concerning the great power competition is for the US. Given Canada's history to reject missile defense and to fail to come to any decision on replacement interceptors, Canada is perceived as not being invested in the defense of North America. Canada and the US are literally talking past each other. But there are opportunities. And as Lindsay Rodman has argued, the Pentagon's latest 2019 Arctic Doctrine invites allies to take more of a role in the Arctic than would otherwise be expected of American defense doctrine. Canada, therefore, can help shape US exercises and priorities when it comes to the Arctic, being as we are the larger North American partner by real estate and have more experience working with Indigenous and other government departments in an Arctic context, albeit in a tactical operational scenario, and more often in land domain scenarios. In a strategic context and in most other domains, the US will still be the lead, especially given that the US Combatant Command Plan ensures that NATO's Supreme Allied Commander is also the US EUCOM commander, and that US NORTHCOM, EUCOM, and INDOPACOM carve the Arctic three ways, a challenge for the US and by extension Canada and NATO allies. Canada and the US lead in Arctic science, and this is the biggest opportunity to improve surveillance, communication, and a better understanding of the Arctic as an ecosystem. The Mosaic is an international consortium of researchers, including Canadian and American scientists, which has purposely embedded a ship in the Arctic ice floe near the North Pole for a year to collect data. Cube satellites and nanosatellites are making data collection far easier, such as on ice thickness, and it will help assist military with tactical communication and improve internet coverage for communities. New hydrogen fuel sources and increased interest in electric cars are being tried, and there is now concerted effort by the 8 Arctic states to preserve and promote Indigenous languages through a variety of media. RadarSat Constellation is providing invaluable information for maritime surveillance and disaster management, which all helps to create a more complete common operating picture. The real innovations are coming from the science community using Indigenous knowledge. What is more, the science communities tend to work together, not apart, which helps to break down miscommunication and misunderstandings. And finally, on the 80th anniversary of the Permanent Joint Board of Defense and its 74-year-old Canada-US Military Cooperation Committee, and now that D&D has 2 new directorates under continental defense policy issues, all of this means that we have in theory the advice architecture in place to consider how best to organize and plan for changes in the Arctic. Here are some of the topics I think we should maybe consider. First is the tri-command structure, NORAD, US NORTHCOM, and CJOC, especially as it relates to the Arctic. Does it need revisiting? The US has an Arctic capability advocate. Perhaps Canada needs the same. The tendency toward domain-specific component commanders, which is quite common in a NATO context, is antithetical to the US goal of joint all-domain command and control. How does Canada achieve this in an Arctic context? Are exercises truly testing novel scenarios by simulating the disappearance of key nodes of capabilities and information and simultaneous crises and disasters? Can we sustain exercises in the North American Arctic for long periods of time? Are we giving due thought to Article 30 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples? And do we think about building and aiding community resilience? And finally, what can be done to ensure new technologies are integrated more quickly into operational solutions? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Charron, for that very interesting presentation. It's always very interesting to hear about the challenges communicating with the United States in the Arctic. Thank you.
So our next speaker is Iris Ferguson. Iris Ferguson is the current Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow in Canada and a senior advisor for the United States Air Force focusing on Arctic security and policy. Previously, she served for the White House Office of Advance, assisting in the execution and strategy for vice presidential engagements overseas, the Department of Commerce's International Trade Administration, structuring and implementing the first federal investment promotion program, Select USA, and as a national security and foreign policy legislative aide for then Senator Joseph Biden on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. She has an MA from Johns Hopkins Paul H. Nitze School of Advanced International Studies and a BA from the University of Arkansas. Welcome, Iris Ferguson.
Thanks so much, and thanks CIC for putting this event on. It's a very timely topic, and one that I think that our two nations can only further our partnership with, and this kind of dialogue is paramount to that. So I've been given the unenviable task of trying to knit together U.S. strategy and in a way that's coherent. And I think one of the challenges is that there are so many disparate pieces to it. As a disclaimer, I should say that these views are my own. They're not the views of the Air Force, nor are they the views of the Council on Foreign Relations. So please take note of that. And I think it's also important that we have this conversation when we talk about the American perspective on the Arctic that many Americans have, that it's largely a frontier, that that much of the Arctic is uninhabitable, that it's kind of this domain that is still very, very remote and removed. The fact that we're an Arctic nation is still, I think, a foreign concept to a lot of Americans in the lower 48. However, I think that's starting to change. And that the Arctic is starting to move into everyday discourse more and more, and that folks are recognizing that the impacts that happen in the Arctic are globally felt, and they're also felt in the lower 48. So my intent for this talk is to talk a little bit about some themes that I've seen over my work in the Pentagon. I've been, as was mentioned, for the last 3 years working for the Air Force in developing their Arctic policy and strategy, and I'm not here to talk about that, but I'm hoping to highlight a few themes that I've seen emerge over the last 3 years in Arctic security policy. And the first is it's a shift from environmental threats as the main topic of conversation to one from threats from nation states. And Andrea talked a little bit about this, about the United States is now very much speaking with much specificity about the role of Russia and China in the region. It's no longer just about environmental security and increased commercial and human activity with the 2014 invasion of Crimea, and then the US National Defense Strategy, which focuses on great power competition and the rise of Russia and China and their potential threats to United States security. There's a real focus on that globally. How is the United States postured to respond globally? But that the Arctic is not immune to this activity either. That there is activity by Russia and China happening in this region, and that we need to potentially up our efforts to monitor and track this. So, using Andrea's parlance, I would say that this is, and/or Dr. Lockenbacher's, that this is in the Arctic scenario and theme that's coming to the fore. The second theme is an increased focus on the homeland and on the U.S. homeland in particular. That before there was really, especially since the Cold War era, there was a notion that the Arctic was a strategic buffer, that there was a bit of risk that we could accept there. But I think certainly with the changes in the environment, the increased maritime activity and human activity, but also the increased technological capabilities of our adversaries, there's been a real shift in how we view the threats coming through the Arctic, that our missile defense architecture has significant gaps to it, that especially considering our adversaries' technological capabilities, that this is a real challenge that we need to look at. And this is a NORAD problem set in addition to a US problem set. And you can see that from the conversations that General Shaughnessy has around DC in the last several years in trying to kind of up the level of conversation. That's General Shaughnessy is the head of NORAD Northcom and in charge of Homeland Defense. he's been trying to kind of beat the drum to show and highlight some of the challenges that we face from a homeland defense perspective, and the Arctic is very much that northern avenue of approach, as Andrea mentioned. The third theme is more of a global perspective. There's an increased use of focus on the rules-based order. So every strategy that's been written on the Arctic has always had something about upholding the international rules-based order. But I think that there's currently a concern that it's slipping away, that there's potentially there's an undermining of the rules-based order going on by Russia, potentially with trying to control the Northern Sea Route, or jamming signals of our allies during exercises, the notion of Chinese debt trap diplomacy, that while I think there was an assumption that the Western and US international rules-based order was going to be upheld, so we're slowly seeing an erosion, and you're seeing the policy and leadership try to amplify this message, I think more so in the last several years. The fourth theme is largely just a shift in geographical perspective. And I think this is the geography of the Arctic, probably for this audience, is not something that's unknown, but I think from the halls of the Pentagon, there's still very much has been an east-west view of the world for quite some time. The maps are still very east-west focused. And as we all know, as folks focus on the Arctic, that really in the map that you can see in front of you, that there's a top-down view is really critically essential for understanding this region and understanding the role that it plays globally. So I do see that there's a shift at the Pentagon in terms of understanding the larger geography and understanding the top-down view of the world. And I also see a domain shift. And by domain, I mean there's various domains that we talk about in the military: sea, air, land, space. But from the historical perspective, I would argue that there's largely been a focus on the maritime domain, especially in the last 10 years, with the focus on sea ice and icebreakers. And obviously this is near and dear to my heart in working in the Air Force, but that there's an added focus of the other domains that are involved in the Arctic, that the air domain is a very critical component of the region. There's a reason why there's so many air bases. It's because it's very hard to operate on the surface. And then when you add in Space Force and the space domain, it's just a further lens from which to view activity in the region. Well, the fifth theme is a shift on focusing on collective action, and that's both internally and externally. So internally, jointly, one of the challenges is who is responsible for the Arctic, and which service is most responsible. I think there's an understanding that it is not just one service, that it's a joint domain that we all need to tackle together. And Andrea talked a little bit about the attempt to try to, from a U.S. perspective, have responsibility for the region be held with NORAD Northcom as the Arctic capabilities advocate. And I think there's utility to that in having a leader, but I think that there's also a recognition that there are real challenges to that structure, that whilst you have NORAD Northcom as a Homeland Defense perspective is owning a lot of the narrative, you still have a lot of the problems that, especially when you talk about the great power competition lens of dealing with Russia handled by European Command, and then you have the China problem set handled by Pacific Command, but most of the forces in Alaska are owned by Pacific Command. So there's just there's a dialogue going on right now about the challenges of responsibility for the region taking place. And then the other collective action is about allies and partners. And as you all know, our relationship with Canada is the strongest that we have, and NORAD is one of our most fundamental security partnerships, and will continue to be there. But I also see a desire to further and deepen these relationships and partnerships. And the Arctic is so unique in that 7 out of 8 of the states are either NATO members or enhanced opportunity partners, and there are there's real upside to trying to continue and drive further partnership between these highly capable and interoperable militaries that are also very geopolitically aligned. So I think that will be a real focus moving forward in the next couple of years, is trying to increase the level of partnerships. And then the last and sixth theme I'd say is that I see a maturation of this conversation on Arctic security at least at the Department of Defense, that there is a move to talk more specifically about operational capabilities. That I think before this has been a little bit of an education and socialization about the Arctic that has happened over the past 10 years. And this in documents and in different forums. But yeah, I think over the last several years, you've seen a desire to highlight and show and demonstrate capability, operational capability that I don't think we had tried to show before. And that can say either by sending the carrier strike group up to Norway for Trident Juncture, or the recent bomber task force that flew over Sweden for the first time. There's a real intent to show capability and what we can do as partners in the region. And then the second is trying to actually speak about the operational capabilities that we need to get after and some of the gaps that exist. And you can see that with NORAD Northcom and various congressional hearings talking about the communications gaps that exist above 65 degrees. It's no longer, hey, this is hard, maybe we'll talk about it. There's actual tangible thoughts about, well, let's put up this type of LEO, low Earth orbiting satellites. Here are some different space assets that we can use for better monitoring in the region. And you can even say that with the icebreaker executive order that was recently put out is just another example of the tangible, the attempts to get after some of these tangible capability shortfalls. So those are some of the 6 themes that and I'm sorry I ran a little bit long, but look forward to answering more questions and continuing the dialogue.
Thank you very much, Iris Ferguson, for that very interesting talk. I found your themes of collective action, specifically on the allies and partners, and the concern on the rules-based order slipping away, very informative. Thank you.
And our final speaker today is Lindsay L Rodman. Lindsay L Rodman is currently the Executive Director of the Leadership Council for Women in National Security. She was the first Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow in Canada after leaving the Obama administration, where she served in the Pentagon as Senior Advisor for the International Humanitarian Policy. Prior to her political appointment, she was an active duty judge advocate in the U.S. Marine Corps, serving in various roles, including as Deputy Legal Counsel to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and as the Operational Law Attorney, for the 1st Marine Division in Afghanistan from 2010 to 2011. Her last duty assignment as an active duty Marine was in the White House as Director for Defense Policy and Strategy at the National Security Council. She remains in the U.S. Marine Corps Reserves. Prior to joining the Marine Corps, Lindsay was an associate at the law firm of Arnold & Porter LLP, now Arnold & Porter K. Scholler, in Washington, D.C. She is a graduate of Harvard Law School, the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, and Duke University. Welcome, Lindsay.
Thank you so much. It's so fantastic to be here. Thank you to CIC and to Andrea for organizing, to the consulate, and to everyone who's enabled this event to happen. I already feel like I got what I wanted to get out of it because I loved hearing what Iris and Andrea had to say. I apologize for those of you who are going to stick with it and hear what I have to say. I feel like we've peaked, but I'll do my best. I also, like Iris, have to do the disclaimer because I remain in the reserves. I have to say that my comments on my own, they don't reflect any sort of official position of the United States Marine Corps. And although I was in government, I'm no longer in government. So nothing I say reflects any position of the US government now, nor should it reflect the position of the US government in the past. This is purely my own opinions and thoughts. And so Andrea sort of came up with the topic for tonight. And she thought opportunities and challenges in the North American Arctic. And our lens tonight, of course, is on security and defense, because that's all of our backgrounds. But before we even get there, from my perspective, and Andrea even talked about this a little bit, we should be talking about how the United States and Canada can work together as a North American entity when it comes to the Arctic. From my vantage point, both when I was living in Canada for a couple of years after I left the Obama administration in 2016, and now having moved back to the US last year, I find we often talk past each other. My husband's Canadian, we often talk past each other too, but specifically related to these issues, we end up raising real issues and important issues, but they're being raised in parallel and not necessarily intersecting conversations. And over time, I've come to see in my mind that the way to understand current challenges and opportunities in the Arctic is to understand that the US is fundamentally strategic in its approach to the Arctic, and Canada is fundamentally operational in their approach. I'm using these terms in their military sense. So military folks in the audience may know what I'm getting at, and so please bear with me. But strategic, operational, and tactical are three levels of planning and organizing that we do for warfare. Strategic considerations are global and implicate broad concepts and goals. Operational considerations are associated with a theater of operations. In the warfare context, it's where we're fighting a war, the country and its surroundings. And then tactical considerations, which is sort of always that third bucket, are associated with specific battles, one location at a time. What I'm not saying is the United States, by thinking more strategically, is thinking more deeply, or that Canada, by thinking operationally, is being operational in the sense that they're operating more in the Arctic. What I'm trying to get at is the United States is strategic in the sense that the American approach to the North American Arctic is driven by its global considerations. And Canada is operational in the sense that the Canadian approach is often driven by considerations that emanate from the North American Arctic, and maybe more specifically, Canada in the North and more broadly. So going one level deeper on this, if we start to really caricaturize the way that the conversation goes, and of course I'm talking in broad strokes here, so there will be exceptions to this. The US is often caricaturized as being security obsessed to the exclusion of all other things. When you're a hammer, you treat everything as if it's a nail. And the reality is that we are strategically oriented, and because of our global posture, we do think and talk in ways that differ perhaps than Canadians. And it is also true that we're obsessed with security. For example, from an American perspective, when we talk about Arctic security, the term security dominates the term Arctic. And we take a narrow view of what security means. We use the term national security nationally as a broad and global term that specifically relates to hard security considerations and foreign policy. Therefore, Arctic security is similar in its use of the word security. Dominating American concerns when it comes to Arctic security, as Iris already mentioned, are concerns about Russia and China and their capabilities. Those are the same concerns that the United States has globally, and concerns about Russia and China and great power are dominating how the US interacts with the entire world, not just the Arctic. If we look to Canada, even by Canadians, is often caricaturized as being passive. The reality is that Canada's operational focus tends to lead Canada to look inward rather than outward. And at times, maybe Canada is a little bit passive. The term Arctic security when I was living in Canada didn't resonate. Whenever I wanted to talk about Arctic security, I found the conversation obviously immediately funneled into a conversation about human security. And to the extent that it does mean hard security, the considerations are often never strategic. They're often quite operational, focused on specific weapon systems or the ability to operate capably in the north of Canada. A small anecdote, I had the great honor of being invited to the Arctic Security Working Group in 2018 in Iqaluit. It was an amazing opportunity for me as an American to be able to sit in that group and to learn from everyone. I was quite surprised in 2 days of thorough meetings about Arctic security. This is the premier venue for Canadians who work on Arctic security issues to convene and to talk about what they're dealing with. The word Russia came up once in 2 days, and it was raised by an amazing academic, but an academic who was also there to participate from an academic perspective, not from a government or a security practitioner perspective. And the only person to say the word China was me. So, that was really interesting to me and very instructive about how Canadian American approaches might differ. In Canada, the focus when talking about Arctic security, in the broader human security sense, but even in conversations that do have a hard security lens, the conversation focuses, perhaps rightly, on Indigenous rights and on a will they, won't they uncertainty about whether developing the Arctic is wise. And finally, on the question of Arctic sovereignty. Sovereignty from a Canadian perspective does not align with what I learned the word to mean when I was in law school, or from an American perspective. It derives essentially from an inability of Canada and the United States jointly as a North American unit to surveil and monitor in its own territory. I posit if you would fix the surveillance and monitoring program, you may have actually addressed much of what Canada identifies as a sovereignty issue in the North. So what are the challenges in the North American Arctic from a hard security perspective? The Americans are right and the Canadians are right. The hard security threat to North America in the Arctic is strategic. For the most part, only long-range bombers, nuclear submarines, ICBMs, perhaps space-based assets, or other strategic weapon systems pose a real threat to or through the North American Arctic. Russia is the only realistic source of these threats right now, and they're increasingly concentrating their capabilities in the North. The threat is also long-term. We need to think about strategic planning in the out years to take on the threat now. And every day, Russia and China find new and interesting ways to cooperate with each other. If you look at long-term trend lines, they're trending towards an alliance. Just last week, the Russian foreign minister said that he did not agree that China was a non-Arctic state. Statements like that continue to go back and forth, and investment in each other's future continues to be the trend. China's influence is rising, and there is potential for China to be an amoral hegemon in the world. The US is concerned about stopping that because we would have difficulty counterbalancing it. Taking the operational perspective, there's no real operational threat to the North American Arctic. So this is where the Canadians are right. To put this in other words, we're not going to be fighting a war in the North American Arctic in the near or medium term. So we should be thinking about human securities when we talk operationally. Those should predominate. There are important security issues to consider at the operational level, but using the American hard security lens to address them actually probably won't get us very far. So why are we talking past each other? At the strategic level, there are very few resources in the United States devoted to this issue. Iris addressed increasing hopes that we'll fix our capability gaps, but we're not there. The White House executive order is something that came out last week. Happy to talk about that in the Q&A if folks are interested, but I don't think it makes much of a difference. When the US has implored people to care about things like China's rise, Chinese footholds in Greenland, or rising Russian military capability, no one else has really stepped up to the plate. The United States will continue to fund its red lines, but there isn't much capacity there beyond that. And from an American perspective, one must take seriously the idea the United States is limited in its resources. Often our allies have difficulty truly embracing that concept. At the operational level, Canadian priority issues, Indigenous rights, the environment, questions about development are not politically popular in the US government currently. That may change, it may not. The US is the only Arctic nation that is also not an Arctic nation. In other words, the persona, the mythos of the United States is not that it's a cold place, and it's not tied up with the Arctic. From the US perspective, the Arctic is often an Alaskan issue, not a federal issue. That doesn't mean the US doesn't care about it or doesn't invest in it, but the lens and the perspective is different. And no other part of the United States is impacted by operational concerns in the Arctic. Of course, there are second and third order consequences, but not directly. So for Canada to move forward and help compel a coherent North American approach, I would posit that a Canadian position on the future of the Arctic from a strategic perspective is essential. American hard security concerns, which are predominantly strategic, have minimal applicability at the operational level. The converse is not true. Canada's focus on human security problems actually needs a global approach for them to be truly solvable. And once you start thinking strategically, global geopolitics become important and hard security issues become relevant as well. This does not mean that Canada needs to be consumed with Russia and China to the extent that the United States is. It does mean that the dialogue with the United States requires understanding that we're worried no one else cares about the global balance of power, only whether the United States might underwrite their security or forge a strong alliance with them to their benefit. So what are the opportunities? I talked a lot about challenges, and I know that I've basically run out of time, so I'll do this quickly. I think strategic opportunities are there. The North Warning System, space, operational opportunities are there as well. Expanding NORAD missions, investing further in NORAD, dual use surveillance and monitoring capabilities, additional patrolling, exercises. All of these are politically popular and feasible in the United States. Issues of binational cooperation between the US and Canada can also often be dealt with at the working level. In other words, they don't require as much political capital. Ultimately, this is a question of resourcing and prioritization, not unpopularity and not any sort of controversy from an American perspective. And since Canada wants these things too, there must be a way for us to talk with each other and not past each other in order to get to yes. I have many other things that I would love to be able to touch on, but I think what I will do instead is wait for the Q&A and see what the rest of you want for us to dig a little bit deeper into and take your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lindsay Rodman, for that very interesting presentation. Very helpful to see how you broke down U.S. strategic issues and Canadian operational issues. Thank you very much.
Excellent. I think this is where I come in for our Q&A. So I have a number of questions. Thank you everyone who has submitted questions in the chat. I'm going to work through what I can. So we're going to start with, I'm going to direct some at individual panelists and then some in clusters, and then I'll give other questions the chance for all three to comment. And when there's dead air, I'll jump in with the next one in that case. So we'll start with Andrea, and we will start with a question, and that is, from a Canadian perspective, can we expect the Conservative leader candidates to say anything new on security in the Arctic and High North?
Well, thanks very much for the question. All prime ministers at one time or another sort of fixate on the Arctic, and I think there are a number of reasons why. One, in the Canadian psyche, the Arctic is something almost mythical. We don't know a lot about it. You know, we're only starting to understand the very complicated history we have with the Arctic and the history of colonization. And one of the advantages of talking about the Arctic when the public doesn't fully understand it is you can make it whatever you want. And especially when prime ministers are always worried about that English-French balance, the Arctic is a great place to focus attention because, of course, there's no language divide. So all prime ministers have talked about the Arctic. Not surprisingly, conservative prime ministers tend to focus on getting tough on security, focusing especially on sovereignty. Harper did this, but of course we should note that the current Liberal government also talks about sovereignty. It's just a little bit more muted. And so the concern in the Arctic, whether it's conservative or liberal, is usually variations on a theme. They just may highlight particular issues more forcefully because it plays to their base. The last thing I'll say though is if we look at sort of the Canada-US relationship, all prime ministers are kind of damned if they do and damned if they don't, because on the right in Canada, any prime minister that focuses on doing more with the US is usually going to be criticized on the right because we're abandoning Europe. And on the left, if we do more with the US, we are ceding sovereignty for Canada. So I do have a little bit of sympathy for all Canadian governments because it's a bit like trying to bowl, but you've always got the gutter guards. There's really not a lot of room for you to play when it comes to issues like the Arctic.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Andrea. And I jumped right into my role as Q&A, but fascinating talks by all three. So thank you very much for your words. And we'll go just down the line. Next to a question for Iris. A couple people in the chat were wondering to hear more about the role of the Arctic Council. They're wondering, has it changed over the last years, and what its current role in dealing with the multiple challenges in the Arctic? And a follow-up to that is, does it have a role in dealing with these issues, even though military security is not within its mandate?
Yeah, and I would certainly welcome Andrea and Lindsay's perspective on the Arctic Council. As many people know, that it's a State Department run versus Department of Defense run entity. Was set up in almost 25 years ago. I think, yeah, they're celebrating their 25th anniversary next year. And, you know, I think it's been a really incredible forum for approaching a lot of the non-security topics, whether that be search and rescue or sustainable development, you know, diplomatic issues. It's been very useful. It obviously changes, the tone changes significantly depending on who is chairing, and it rotates the chair every 2 years. So it was the U.S. and now it was Finland, and then now it's Iceland, and the next chairmanship will actually be Russia, and I think that will be really interesting to figure out how the tone of the Arctic Council might change with Russia. And I think as the US government, I think we're working through how we will handle our diplomatic efforts with them as they're the chair. That being said, I do think it's been a very useful forum. I think some people can criticize it because it's maybe too slow to act and maybe doesn't has, it's kind of can get mired down in its own internal working groups in a consensus-based model that it can be very hard to achieve with all the people at the table. I think there are also challenges to the continued addition of non-Arctic states as observers to the council, that it's not just Arctic states anymore. Certainly you saw our own Secretary of State voicing some pretty strong opinions about China's role in the Arctic Council during the Arctic Council ministry in Finland last year. And he focused specifically on the fact that they're a non-Arctic state and that they're potentially trying to exert influence and governance norms in the region, which he doesn't think that they have a role in doing. So I think there's a little bit of tension there between the Arctic states and the non-Arctic states within the council. And then from a security perspective, I think that there's a real tendency to shy away from everything security related and not even include anyone that's a part of the military in the conversations. Like you can't even listen in, for example, just because of the optics of it. And that includes the Coast Guard, which is largely, for search and rescue. So I think that there's from a security perspective, a real challenge over the coming years of how we're going to approach security from a collective perspective. There isn't really a solid forum for discussing security matters across Arctic states. And I think that will continue to be a challenge going forward. So those are my thoughts.
Excellent. Okay, well, we'll move on. And again, please jump in, other panelists. If you would like to tack onto some of these questions, we'll move to a couple that involve two or all of you in a moment. But one more for Lindsay. I'm just wondering, there is a question that says, any thoughts on how defense and security enhances or investments in the Arctic can contribute to economic development in the region?
Thank you. That's a great question. And it helps actually highlight my strategic operational divide a little bit, because it, of course, implies an operational approach to how we're thinking about defense and security investments, right? Because the ones that will have a positive economic impact are the ones that are operational, the ones that pertain to the Alaskan economy or the Canadian North, or even the broader Canadian economy. The strategic investments in Arctic security would be things long range, ICBMs, nuclear sub capability. The sort of in between would be something like an icebreaker, which is both. And the ability for surface vessels to be both in the North American Arctic, but then perhaps operate more strategically as well. So it kind of depends on which lens you're looking at and what you're investing for and why. So the Canadian Arctic Offshore Patrol Vessel, the American icebreaking capability, those have, of course, a military first use, but they have some dual use capability, and they will enable commerce, they will enable science, they will do things that will hopefully also inure to benefit broader than the hard security landscape. When we're building long-range bombers, we're not impacting the economy of the Canadian or American North, and nor is that sort of a part of the calculus or how we think about their use. So sometimes yes, sometimes no, in terms of whether it's helpful or not.
Yeah, I'd love to chime in. I love that question because it's something that is often talked about at the Department of Defense. I think the Arctic is challenged a little bit because of the lack of a profit model for many private sector companies to invest in the region. And so you end up seeing a lot of gaps where there are no problems in the lower 48, there are significant gaps in the North that we're all very familiar with. And so the Department of Defense or defense assets are often looked at as a hook to try to stimulate investment in infrastructure, whether that be airfields or ports or roadways that are deemed necessary under national security. And I think that there's, you know, there's truth to some of that needing to happen, that sometimes there can be dual use capacities for defense infrastructure. But I think in the Arctic in particular, I think if there is no profit, you know, private sector incentive for folks to invest, then, and if there is a desire for the government to take the lion's share of, or at least to stimulate the investment, then it really needs to be a whole of government approach to that. It's not necessarily just a defense and military issue. It's you know, how are you promoting investment, economic investment at large? And so this is certainly a conversation that we have fairly frequently about where our investments are going and to what end they can potentially be dual use, but also not to be over reliant on security assets as the primary means for economic development.
Thanks. I would just add a couple of things. I think sort of combining the economic with the security, and especially because, you know, there was a lot of media attention to the fact that there were concerns that China was quote unquote buying Greenland, and then the US government offered to reciprocate. When we're talking about the Arctic, we are talking about communities that are smaller, have smaller tax bases, in some cases can't get enough funds from sort of a traditional tax system. And so when you lack infrastructure, there's always the concern that perhaps there are outside either states or companies that are going to offer to provide infrastructure because it's badly needed, and you know, the community itself can't pay for it. And so we have to balance. We always want to be careful in both Canada and the US, making sure that critical infrastructure isn't owned, controlled by potential adversaries. But on the other hand, we cannot be so restrictive that we deny communities the opportunity to develop just because we may have an over sensitivity to any sort of investment. The other thing I'd echo is what what Iris said, was that especially in a Canadian context, whenever we're talking about any sort of development and infrastructure, we've got to try and make it dual use. It is just too expensive to have a separate sort of satellite system for only community use versus government use. I'm sure we have the technology that we can make most infrastructure dual use so that it always benefits both the community and the military and security forces.
Excellent, thank you very much. And we have another one. This deals with Canadian deficit spending and COVID-19. So anyone can feel free to jump in on this one. Given recent Canadian deficit spending, in order to combat the negative effects of COVID-19 and the large number of procurement projects Canada is currently engaged in, how will COVID affect procurement of the North Warning System replacement? What progress has been made on Northwest Warning System replacement in general, given its obsolescence in 2025 and lacking specificity of commitments in SSE? Sorry, a bit of a mouthful there, but hopefully you got that down.
Okay, well, I'll start, but Lindsay and Iris, of course, feel free to jump in. So the North Warning System, Canada and the US have been working on it for a number of years. We know that it's going to reach at some point its end of operational life. But I think what you're going to see, and this is even pre-COVID-19, that we're going to try and extend the life of the North Warning System. There's still a lot of utility to it. And if we wait for the perfect, all singing, all dancing, brand new North Warning System that's probably got a space-based asset to it, and it's a system of systems and all of that, well, if we wait for that kind of perfection, we may end up with nothing. And so I think in this case, in a COVID-19 case where we are concerned about how much of a recession or a deficit spending we're in, This is where these sort of procurement projects are a boon for communities, especially if we make sure that they are part of the solution in terms of either the contracting or the maintenance or the involvement in this kind of solution. I think, you know, COVID-19, it's true that the Department of Defense is a big chunk of the government budget, but it's also money that goes into salaries. It's money that can go into procurement projects, all of which does help the economy. So I'd rather not think of it as, because we're in a deficit, therefore we've got to cut off all spending in a defense or in security capacity. If anything, this is the time, especially if we're smart, we make this dual use and we make sure we involve the communities. These can be the stimuli that get economies going.
Yeah, and I'll just briefly follow up on that. And it's hard to for me to speak to Canadian spending. I'm sure from the U.S. perspective, we would love to see more, as we are constantly beating the drum for. But the North warning system is complicated, as Andrea mentioned. It's old and becoming obsolete. But there are attempts at trying to modernize it. There's a binational committee that's been set up to try to look at an analysis of alternatives for the North warning system, but between the U.S. and Canada, to try to figure out what does that ground replacement system look like, and or is it not just a ground replacement system? I think that at the same time that the studies ongoing, there are also significant transformations happening within the space sector, allowing for potential cheaper technologies and more rapidly deployable technologies from the space domain. So I think that there's lots of different avenues that are being looked at. It's not necessarily a typical replace this system with a similar system and minor upgrades. I think that there's actually a very strong and concerted thinking about the missile defense architecture at large and what is needed for and between NORAD and NORTHCOM. And if you go and listen to General Shaughnessy's testimony about there was a hearing to the Senate on Arctic security a few months ago, and he speaks about their efforts to try to look at a systems of systems approach for developing this new architecture that would potentially be a part of the North. I think the North warning system would be a part of it, but not the entirety. So there are continued efforts, and I just would say that it's a tricky problem to solve, and it's expensive, and it will require some significant commitment by both governments, not just Canada, to move forward.
Certainly universities enjoy these big projects because this is an opportunity for engineers to get involved. So it's, these kind of projects can be very beneficial to all segments of society.
Excellent, thank you so much. And we have another one to open it to the panel. And that is, do any of the panelists consider there to be a need for an ongoing pan-Arctic, including Russia, hard security forum?
No. There is an interest from the Arctic exceptionalist perspective that because there's been this history of cooperation in the Arctic, that we should disregard the rest of global geopolitics and assume a ultimately collaborative approach to the Arctic. And I love the notion of Arctic exceptionalism. I think that it actually can make really important and valuable progress in a bunch of areas. And so I'm not gonna cast out the notion of Arctic exceptionalism. I think the Arctic can be exceptional in certain ways, but when Arctic exceptionalism counsels in favor of frankly throwing Russia a bone and rewarding bad behavior, it just I am not personally convinced that it makes a lot of sense. There's nothing about Russia's behavior recently or at any point since 2014 that tells me that they are interested in and genuine in their interest in collaboration writ large. I do think that they try to walk the walk and talk the talk in the context of the Arctic because it is culturally appropriate within that context. Like they're sort of culturally astute enough to understand that. But I guess what I'm saying is I don't really believe it. And as Iris noted earlier, you know, the United States has also historically done that, and Secretary Pompeo's approach to the Arctic Council ministerial last year was really, I think, very jarring to the Arctic Council, and so noteworthy because it was really the first time that any country has made statements in the context of the Arctic that sound more like the way that we interact outside of the Arctic. And I won't necessarily, you know, my comments are not meant to either be in favor or opposed to what Secretary Pompeo said. I guess just broadly the sense that there can be constructive and valuable cooperation with Russia in the Arctic, to me, and again, because I'm American and because I'm coming from a more strategic perspective, strategic meaning globally oriented and maybe anti-Arctic exceptionalist in this sense. It doesn't make sense from my perspective, but there are very, very good arguments for it as well. I'm just presenting the case against.
Well, I'll chime in. We actually do have a few. We have, for example, for a while there, the Arctic states, the what they call the Arctic CHODs, the Chief of Defenses, would get together and have a conversation. But a lot of this stopped as a result of the annexation of Crimea. And so I certainly sympathize with Lindsay's thinking. We have other sort of fora. We have the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, and that's where you do get a mix of military and civilian agencies that do tabletop exercises. So that's an opportunity to talk about security. And then there's also the NATO, I always forget the name, I think it's Arctic Security Working Group Forum, which used to invite Russia as an observer. And I've heard sort of two ways to look at that. Certainly after 2014, Russia was not invited anymore. But I've also heard that a seat is available should Russia want to come and join, but they've declined the offer. So it's a bit of a he said, she said scenario. But and maybe this is because you know, I don't represent one of the great powers, but I always think any opportunity where you can get states to talk is a good thing. I don't think, however, having those hard security and defense conversations in an Arctic Council setting is advised. The Arctic Council does really great stuff. Its mandate is environmental protection and sustainable development. Footnote 1 in the Ottawa Declaration to create the Arctic Council specifically says we are not going to talk about hard security issues, and that was required by the United States. So I don't see them wanting to open up that, and we are getting a lot of good coming out of the Arctic Council, so I don't think adding this element would be helpful, although because we have now a search and rescue agreement, because we're working together on oil spill preparedness, which again does have a military aspect to it, mainly because they often have the equipment needed, we are able to sort of talk on the margins about security issues.
Yeah, and I will add, like, there is dialogue between the Russian Coast Guard and the American Coast Guard in the Bering area, right? Like to the extent that we need it for people to function at the tactical and operational level, it happens. It's a question of like in the broader context.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in. You know, I fall into both camps, quite frankly. I feel there's, I agree with Lindsay that there's not really been a lot of redeeming activities by Russia recently to warrant a collaborative approach to a region. I think that they often see the Arctic as a means to come to the table, actually, because there's been such a history of cooperation. But I think it's really challenging in today's environment, given what we've seen in the past. And that being said, you know, it's also really critically important that people that are making decisions understand motivations and intentions. And it's really hard to understand motivations and intentions when you don't have a structured dialogue. So to the extent that could be set up in some other capacity, and we lean a lot on our allies and partners, quite frankly, who are on the front lines in these regions. And I think that, again, as I said before, when Russia takes over the chairmanship of the Arctic Council, I think we'll really, you know, have to have more clear lines from the U.S. government, and that'll become a little bit more clear in the next couple of years.
Excellent. Thank you all for that. And to go to a question talking about the North American Arctic strategy, I wanted to get some feedback perhaps from Iris and Andrea on a piece that Lindsay recently did. And Lindsay, feel free to chime in to give more context than I'm going to here. But Lindsay discussed in a policy perspective that a North American Arctic strategy is necessary. And she said, only cooperation between the United States and Canada can achieve a holistic, integrated, and interoperable defense of the continent. And that going it alone so far has left both countries incapable of securing their own territory. So I will turn it over to the panelists to comment.
Well, I can start. This is music to my ears. My colleague Jim Ferguson and I write about NORAD a lot. And, you know, we see the functional logic of having eventually a North American Defense Command. So not just focused on air defense and maritime warning, but actually, you know, other domains involved. So I think when you look at North America and the threats that are facing it, the borders really don't matter from a threat perspective, because with new technology, they can so easily hit Canada or the United States. But there are a couple of things we need to think about. North America includes more than just Canada and the US. And so, you know, far into the future, something we may need to consider is, well, what about Mexico? And if, you know, Greenland becomes independent, maybe we should be considering Greenland in a North American context as well. So, you know, if we're projecting out quite some time, I think we really do need to work together more often. But, you know, I note that when we had back-to-back Arctic Council chairships, we didn't coordinate. We had the opportunity, like the Norwegian and what is it? Norwegian, Finland, Iceland. Anyways, they sort of joined forces so that you could have 6 years of planning in terms of Arctic Council projects. Canada and US had it back to back, and yet we didn't manage to get together on a coordinated agenda. So.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Lindsay's sentiment. I mean, there's so many synergies there. There's so many overlapping interests, and obviously historical partnerships that it's kind of a little bit of a no-brainer. But this seems to be it very much is in both of our interests, I think, to take a deeper dive at our collective defense I do, but you know, to Andrea's point, that I think that sometimes it's hard for us to come to the table, and maybe we are talking past each other, like Lindsay said. So I don't know if we need to first, you know, give a dictionary to each other and try to define what our objectives and goals are before we come to the table, because I think sometimes this is, you know, this happens with other allies and partners, that you get caught up in the talking points and the noise, and you don't actually drive into actually building interoperability with one another, and to building dependencies on one another, which is really the whole intention of allies and partnerships, is building and quite frankly trusting one another. And if you don't build dependencies, then there's no way to build trust. So yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with the sentiment.
Excellent. Okay, so another question, again, I'll turn it over to all. This question had several endorsements on the Q&A. So this is, what do local actors, Indigenous peoples, local populations see as the key security priorities in the Arctic? And perhaps this is more from your experience or what you've been able to glean from that. And if priorities are not the same as governments, what are US and Canadian governments doing to engage local populations in national priorities? And how is government Arctic strategy addressing local grievances? And one more follow-up there, is there evidence that foreign powers are attempting to exploit the gap between local and government national priorities?
Okay, well, I'll start. I'll take it. I think that one of the biggest things I see about the desires for Indigenous communities is making sure that they have a seat at the table, that they're included in conversations that impact their homeland and their territory, which makes complete sense. And that, whether that be Alaska Natives or, even when we're talking about, efforts at Thule Air Base and working with the local Greenlandic population there, making sure that there's transparency in, at least from a Department of Defense perspective, what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how our activities are going to impact them. So, we really try, we have a tribal liaison dedicated completely to working with Alaska Natives in Alaska. And we have folks dedicated to the same effort in Greenland. And, I would love Canada's perspective on how they work closely with their Indigenous communities, because I think that, and in some ways, and we talked about this, a few days ago, that you guys are far afield from the United States in some ways, in terms of actually talking about some of the challenges that Indigenous communities face and the role that the government should be playing. But from the U.S. perspective, I think that trying to, like I said, ensure that there's a seat at the table and that there's active transparency, and that if we see things that could potentially impact their community, that whether that be our own activities or the activities of adversaries, that we let them know. People get nervous when they see planes flying overhead and fighter jets and bombers, and they don't know why, understandably. So trying to be out front and have communication with these communities, I think is really paramount. But I would love to hear the Canadian perspective.
So it's many of the same things. It's actually having a say in the decisions that are made. Canada is working specifically on continuing with reconciliation and finishing the devolution of decision-making power to many of the Arctic communities and territories, and that's going to continue. One of the things that the Canadian government has worked with communities to do is to create more resiliency within the communities. They already have a lot, but it's things like, for example, they're often the first responders when something happens in the Arctic. And so we have things like the Ranger program, the Junior Ranger program. We now have an auxiliary Coast Guard program so that locals have more training, because they have to be their own firefighters. They're usually first on the scene of accidents. And so it's building that resiliency. But specifically in terms of security threats, and it depends where you are, it's wrong for us to think of the Arctic as a monolith, but certainly in the Eastern Arctic, lack of adequate housing, cost of food, lack of internet access, cost of travel, the fact that there's still no mental health services. It's these basic services that really are about the security of the person that I think we're still waiting to see them come to parity in terms of services that we expect here in Winnipeg or in most places in Canada. I think the days, sadly, of the South going up and telling the Arctic what they need, that's happening less and less, but still we can be a little tone deaf. We often come with preconceived assumptions and notions. And so actually asking and involving them and remembering, Canada's obligations, for example, under the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and especially Article 30 in a military context, it's expected that they do be involved and ask, especially if they're doing exercises or maneuvers on Indigenous land, that they have consulted with the local community.
And I don't know that this is exactly what the questioner was getting at, but another really important semi-local constituency is the state of Alaska in the United States. So in the Canadian North, I think there's much, I don't want to speak too much for it, and I apologize if this isn't well framed, but there's a sense that like Indigenous populations in the North are, if not a majority constituency, at least like comprising a lot of the concern of the population in the North. In Alaska, the Alaska Native population is still a small minority to the mostly white population who have come there from lower 48 at some point. And they are an interesting and very powerful constituency as compared with, as a state, as compared perhaps with some other states by population, by landmass. They're our biggest state. The two senators from Alaska are both very adamant about the hard security concerns of the United States that emanate from the Arctic and about the Arctic. They are powerful and successful advocates for increasing defense assets being moved to Alaska or being focused on Alaska or thinking about Alaska. So it is a really interesting constituency in the United States that operates very differently than the Canadian territories do, for example, in this space. Our land capability in the Arctic is basically the Alaska National Guard in the North American Arctic, and that is, of course, a state asset. So that creates another interesting dynamic there. And then to the question about foreign powers attempting to exploit the gap, which wasn't really touched upon. The Chinese delegations do tend to interact at the state level. So you had the Governor Walker go with a state delegation over to China to talk trade, and China sent a delegation to Alaska to talk trade. And they're doing that essentially independently of the national government. They're talking sort of state to China. And we are simultaneously criticizing other countries for letting China have a foothold in their Arctic and welcoming Chinese investment in the state of Alaska and in developing their economy and their capabilities. And that is a real tension. But since we have articulated a concern about the type of foothold that China has gotten in the Canadian North, in Greenland, I think it's only fair to highlight that these tensions between economic development and what to do about increasing Chinese influence exist in Alaska as well.
Excellent, thank you so much. So I will pose one more question to the panel, and then feel free to add any concluding words as well before we turn it back over to Robert. So the final question deals with scientific cooperation. So with respect to scientific cooperation, how do the US and Canada see or cope with scientific engagement by China and Russia? And the question poses a follow-up just saying, as the US and Canada, science tends to be supported by military logistics and infrastructure.
Well, I can start this. This isn't necessarily unique to the Arctic, but I'm noticing that, for example, CSIS and CIC and our other security services are starting to realize how vulnerable scientists can be to manipulation by foreign scientists who have state backing. Often because, we're focused on a particular program, and if we are not fully aware of perhaps background agendas of other states and how they use their scientists, you can run into trouble quickly. And so certainly CSIS and CSE are doing a big campaign that applies in all science cooperative deals with especially China, especially in a COVID-19 scenario, to be very careful. Do you know the scientists? What are the common goals? Are they being manipulated? That sort of thing. Canada has the High Arctic Research Station in Cambridge Bay, and certainly we are very open to having international scientists come and do work there, but we're also clear about some of the ground rules. They have to do it in consultation with local populations, and we try and always pair them with Canadian researchers, so we're not all going off and doing the same research, that there's sort of a synergy of efforts. Probably we all need to think a little bit more, especially when it comes to Chinese scientists, about what are the strings that they have back to Beijing that we may not know about. I think that comes with the fact that we're now in great power competition, and China especially likes to use misinformation and likes to has a big plan in terms of the Silk Road and the Belt and Road Initiative to make sure that they have footholds everywhere. It's not necessarily always nefarious, but it's something that we probably have to pay attention to a little bit more.
Yeah, and I would just, echo some of what Andrea's already said. I think that there's a challenge because of how many of much of our research is conducted by universities, that might have federal contracts, but they are, responsible for, conducting the research themselves. And I think some of the activity by China in particular is very much state controlled. And so I think there's a bit of a mismatch in the ownership of the research. And I think that as Andrea mentioned, you're seeing a bit of an awakening of sorts of the type of research folks that are coming along on some of the joint research projects that are done, and trying to ensure that there's proper vetting. It's not to say that there should be a shutdown of all scientific collaboration. That's absolutely, it's terrible. I think that there's a lot of great scientific cooperation that can happen internationally. But I do think that it's important to have the eyes wide open about who is participating and potential motives, and having the proper infrastructure to vet. And I also think that, we see it's sometimes questionable, some activity that we see that is under the guise of research is potentially intelligence collection. And so we just need to be very mindful that's of various activities, just to be clear-eyed.
The only thing I would say, though, I worry about a climate of othering people and assuming that anybody from particular countries you need to be wary of. And I really worry about the backlash for international students in both Canada and the US. They are vital. It's so important that we have these kind of academic exchanges, and that they continue and that they thrive. We just have to be aware, however, that whereas Canadian students and US students often have the luxury of saying whatever they want and pursuing the research they want, that sometimes other scientists don't have that luxury, that there are invisible ties, sometimes visible ties back to the state, and we just need to be aware of those.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much. I want to thank the CIC Winnipeg for teaming up with NADSN tonight to host this with us and for us. And before I turn it over to Robert, just one quick plug for our next NADSN Ideas series. Will be coming up on July 23rd, and it will be on present and future challenges to governing emerging technologies. So keep an eye out for that. But thank you all very much, and I will turn it over to Robert to end off this evening.
Thank you, Shannon, and thank you to our three panelists, Lindsay, Andrea, and Iris. Great insights. We really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us this evening. Unfortunately, we had to cut the Q&A off with a number of questions left unanswered, so I have captured those, and I will send them to Shannon, and she can share them with the panelists. And I'm just going to share my screen because there's a couple of things I want to share with you. In particular, we have a bunch of CIC events coming up. 3 of them are on the screen as we speak. CIC Ottawa, Quebec, and Montreal are all running events in the next week or so. And then there's a whole bunch more. And I think it adds up to somewhere around 10 events over the next 2 weeks. So the CIC has grand ambitions and we're extremely busy. And we hope that some of you, some of our visitors can come back and join us again. And so with that, I will thank everyone for joining us. Thank our speakers again. Thank Tony for the support of the Winnipeg consulate here. Thank my helpers from the CIC who did their bit for me and did the introductions and thank yous. Thank you to Shannon for moderating the Q&A. And if you have any questions or comments you'd like to share with us, I've put contact information on the screen for the Winnipeg chapter, the CIC, and for the NADSN, I think she pronounced it. And of course, the web pages, you can always go there to find more information. So on that note, I would like to wish everyone a good evening.
Thanks, Lindsay and Iris, for doing this, and Shannon and Robert and everybody for organizing this.
Thank you all. This was great.
Thanks so much. I learned a lot. So that was great. Thank you, everyone.
I think we all learned a lot.
Yeah, thank you.
Having worked two tours in NORAD some years ago now, it was nice to get a bit of a refresher on what's going on in the broader scheme.